can't do anything about it. So last week we left off with the words of Dr. Mary Neal concerning hope, faith, and trust that was so enlightening, and I thought that helped us understand that how David had trust in God. But like all of us at times, he got into the flesh, and he abandoned his trust for a short time, and also maybe he abandoned his faith and his hope as well. And he basically kicked God off the throne, thinking logically that he knew better, or as we'll soon see, he kicked God off because of what David desired for himself. And which again is what we tend to do. But the difference in what we pointed out last week in many people in David is, and what made David a man after God's own heart, when he did do that, he repented and he surrendered his life back to God, and he stopped feeding the lust of his flesh. And I thought, you know, when I study this stuff speaks to me. You know what I mean? And I thought, oh my gosh, I mean, things that I need to surrender, and things that I need to just give him my flesh. And that's it. It's not you overcoming by yourself. It's you saying, Lord, here's my flesh, here's my desires, here's my, wants and desires, here's, my stubborn places, here's everything, and I surrender it to you. And that's the Christian life. Not trying to overcome yourself, not trying to do better yourself, not trying to be a better person, all that, because guess what? None of us can. We can only do it through his strength and through him working in us. And so David did this, and he surrendered these sinful acts, if you will, that we hadn't even got to yet. But we've read some of them, but he's got more to come. And then he surrendered the results. And I think that's somewhere where that's hard to do sometimes. Because especially if you really don't know the nature of God, you really don't know that he's for you and not against you, you'll be afraid to surrender areas of your life because you're afraid of what he may call you to do. But we've got to surrender not just sin, but we got to surrender everything and trust him that he knows what's best for us. And of course, first thing that comes to my mind is who to marry. Now, how many of you prayed, oh God, I want you let me marry so-and-so, and then, years later you didn't marry so-and-so. Oh, thank you, God, that I didn't marry so-and-so. Because he knows better than you do. And so oftentimes what we want for ourselves is not what's perfect and what's best for us. And he knows, and we don't, and that's why we've got to surrender to him. So we're going to pick up in 2 Samuel chapter 2, starting in verse 8. 2 Samuel chapter 2, starting in verse 8. And it says, But Abner, the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, and over the Asherites, and over Jezreel, and over Ephraim, and over Benjamin, and over all of Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. All right, so the captain of the guard, Saul's guard, now you got to put yourself in his place, okay? He's been on Saul's side. Now Saul's dead. Now I'm afraid, he's afraid he's going to lose his position, because what's the likelihood of David keeping him on as his guard? Probably none. Okay, so I think he did this to finagle his way to stay in power, and Ishbosheth evidently is not a strong leader, okay, but he is Saul's son, and so we know that Ishbosheth did not go to battle that day, and so he lived. So Abner put him in as set him up as the king, and. So, I was thinking, do you think Donald Trump would keep Biden's captain of the guard? No, you're fired. Okay, So it could be that also, you know, trying to see it from every direction, it could be that he didn't trust David either. Okay, because you know he's been fighting against David, and also you could say, well, he knows what David's been doing, that he's been consorting with the enemy for a year and a half. You know, all these things are, you just don't know what everybody's thinking. But I tend to think that the first case scenario is correct, that Abner, you know, fought for Saul, and he trying to keep his position. So I think Abner was loyal to Saul, and I think he stayed that way until after his death, at least until now. And maybe his heart is pure. Maybe he really wants to put Ishbosheth in there. Maybe because you know, he's still being loyal to Saul. I don't know, but I sure hope that. I'm sure hoping that he could get Saul's son installed as king and continue his comfy job. I think that's what he's hoping, right? It could, just knowing human nature. So remember when we talked about the sons of Saul in detail, and he had 6 sons, 3 died with him in battle and 3 stayed with him behind for whatever reason we don't know, or stayed behind. So Ishbosheth was one of them, and he was about 40 years old when this happened, and most likely he was the oldest of the remaining sons. So Abner, the captain of the guard, he knows that David's been anointed king of Israel. He works out this political ploy for his own good, I'm assuming. And again, because we know human nature, and I don't think we should kid ourselves. And he gets the people to go along with this plan, and he puts him into power, and he puts him in as king. So he could have said, and you could just hear it now. You could just hear him saying, you know, our master knew what a scoundrel, you know, David was. And for a year and a half, he's been living and fighting with the enemy, the Philistines. Can't you just hear him, you know, politicking out there to get them to go for Ishbosheth instead of going for David? And I can just hear the boos of the crowd rising up. Yeah, David's a traitor, you know. And so now Israel, for the first time, is divided. And this is clearly not God's will. Okay, because David was supposed to be the king. And so this is just simply Satan at work. And he's trying to divide the land. He's trying to divide the people. He's trying to divide the whole plan of God. Why? To mess it up, to keep Messiah from coming. And that's what you see from Genesis till Jesus came. You're going to see Satan trying to spoil the plan to keep Jesus from coming. And then we can't forget the fact that there was no high priest. Remember, and Samuel was not the high priest. He was standing in the office of high priest. He was acting as high priest, but he was not really the high priest. But now Samuel's been gone, and there's been nobody to replace him. So now they don't have that spiritual leadership. So they're kind of out there floundering around. And so this really presents a problem in Israel, being divided, which they knew was not God's will. They can't bring forth God's will when they're divided like that. It was, the Bible say that a divided house cannot stand. You know, and so we can learn from this and apply it to our own lives. You know, in a marriage, a divided house will not stand. In a job, in politics, in anything, we've seen that with Democrats and Republicans refusing to work together. A divided house will not stand. It eventually will fall. So I think we really need to understand this division here, and understand that there were 12 tribes that made up Israel. Those 12 descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. So there was Abraham, who started it all with God's call. And you know, we were talking about you know, how the Bible got started, and did God just give it to one man? And Abraham came up. No, Abraham was called to be the father of the nation, but the word of God was not just given to Abraham. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't just given to one man, but no, he had the call to be the first one to be the progenitor of this nation. And so Abraham was called by God, and then he had the promised son Isaac, who was the promised seed. Then Isaac had Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons, and those 12 sons are where we get the 12 tribes of Israel. So you can just imagine the infighting and the differences of opinions that ensued between all these boys. And of course, this went way back to Rachel and Leah, who were the mothers. And then Jacob had two sister wives, Leah and Rachel. So Jacob had a divided house even back then, you could say, and that was in Genesis 37, 1 through 11. Not to mention the enmity between Jacob and his brother Esau. So Satan he's always there trying to spoil everything. And if you remember, Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and Benjamin was Jacob's youngest son. And David was from the tribe of Judah, as was Jesus. And we know Jesus came through the line of David through Mary, but Joseph also was from David's line. So Joseph and Mary were from the tribe of Judah. So right now, because of Abner, if we come back up to speed, right now because of Abner, the kingdom is now divided. See, it's Abner's fault. And the ones loyal to Saul wanted Saul's son as king, and the rest of Israel wanted David as king. So see, we got a civil war going. And then when we get into 2 Samuel 3:1, where David, he's going to win, and he's going to bring the 12 tribes back together under his rule as king. But if you think about it, if you keep up with all of Israel's politics, their politics are usually in a mess. And I'm talking about today. And they don't seem to be able to agree on much of anything. And this is simply history just constantly repeating itself. For during David's lifetime, as we're going to read in 2 Samuel chapter 15, David's son Absalom is going to rise up against him, against his father and against the king, David, and he's going to attempt to take the throne. So he interestingly set up his kingdom in Hebron, which at one time was the capital of the land. So you just see this history just constantly repeating itself, and just Satan working to divide and conquer all the time. And then later, after David's death and his son Solomon became king, they saw even more unrest when another man named Jeroboam rebelled against Solomon. And I believe he too was hungry for power. And I believe in truth, he rose up against God's anointed because Solomon had turned from God. And God gave the power to Jeroboam, and the kingdom was once again divided. Because God said, they have forsaken me and have not walked in my ways. So you can read that in 1 Kings 11:26 through 40. And it says, let's see, 1 Kings 12:19 says, so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So the northern kingdom, I'm just giving you some history so we can understand, how this all started and how it's still going on today. But the northern kingdom was called Israel. It was sometimes called Ephraim in Scripture, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. And so from the divine viewpoint, the division was a judgment on not keeping God's commands, specifically the commands prohibiting idolatry. And so from a human viewpoint, the division was the result of tribal discord and political unrest. So there's a principle at work here, and that is that sin always brings division. And that tells us in 1 Corinthians 1:13 and James 4:1. And it did back then, and it still does today. And so the southern kingdom of Judah was where Jerusalem and the temple were located. So the good news is that God in his mercy has promised a reuniting of the northern and southern kingdoms. So listen to what Isaiah said. He said, he will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. Ephraim's jealousy will vanish and Judah's enemies will be destroyed. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, nor Judah hostile towards Ephraim. That was in Isaiah 11:12 through 13. So guess when that happened? in 1948. So, you know, my mother was born in 1930, and I'm sure if she ever read that as a little girl, I mean, you'd think, you know, how in the world is this going to happen? I mean, they're literally scattered out across the whole entire world. How are you gonna bring them back? And how are they not even going to be? How are they going to be one nation? How are they going to be no longer, you know, jealous or their enemies destroyed and all this kind of stuff? I mean, I think it'd be a hard thing for back then for them to even contemplate. And so this happened in 1948, and they became one people. Although, like I said, they're still dealing with conflict from within. I don't exactly understand how their politics works. It's very complicated. Of course, I've really never set out to study it, but from what I hear, it's way more complicated than ours, I think. But they had to unite to survive. And that happened. And so, but when the Prince of Peace, when Jesus Christ comes in the millennial reign, we know that all hostility, jealousy, conflict among the tribes will be put to rest. But going back to David, but it was 7 years and 6 months before David was able to bring the two kingdoms back together. Isn't that amazing? 7 years and 6 months. They were out of God's will. And that was 2 Samuel 5:5. So and then again, when David died, then it happened again, and Solomon took the throne. See, it was one kingdom then, but it split again because of sin. And that was recorded in 1 Kings 11:31. So this would take place pretty soon after Solomon's son Rehoboam would take the throne, that the nation was split again. And that's an interesting story. And I want to take just a minute for us to understand what happened and what we can learn from it. So in 1 Kings 12, the tribes of the northern kingdom came and spoke to Rehoboam and told him that under his father they had endured a heavy tax burden, and they wanted relief if they were going to serve Rehoboam. And you know this story, but it's pretty interesting. So in verse 5, he tells them to depart and come back in 3 days, and he would have an answer for them. So in those 3 days, he consulted. Well, let's see who he consulted. In verse 6, it says, "And King Rehoboam consulted with the old men who stood before Solomon his father while he yet lived, and said, How do you advise that I may answer these people? And they spoke unto him, asking, If you will be a servant unto this people this day, and will serve them and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. But he forsook the counsel of the old men, which they had given him, and he consulted with the young men, who were grown up with him, and which stood before him. And he said unto them, What counsel give you, that we may answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, Make the yoke which your father did put upon us lighter? And the young men who were grown up with him spoke unto him, saying, Thus shall you speak unto this people who spoke unto you, saying, Your father make our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter unto us. Thus shall you say unto them, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's loin. And now, whereas my father did lay with you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father has chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the third day, as the king has appointed, saying, Come to me again the third day. And the king answered the people roughly, and forsook the old men's counsel that they gave him, and spoke to them after the counsel of the young men, saying, My father made your yoke heavy, and I will add to your yoke. My father also chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. Wherefore the king hearkened not unto the people, for the cause was from the Lord, that he might perform his saying, which the Lord spoke by Abijah the Shilonite unto Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now, I read you all that to reiterate what I was saying earlier about David not having mercy on the young man who killed, or supposedly killed, Saul. because he was young and stupid perhaps, because we really don't know if that's the way it went down. That's the way the young man said it went down, but we don't know if that's really the way it went down. And here Jeroboam is not taking the advice of the old men who were well knowledgeable in the affairs of the kingdom and the king and how to run the nation. And instead of listening to the people in the know, he listened to his young friends who knew nothing. And this is a message for young people. Mm-hmm. And if your friends don't know much more than you do. Yeah. Okay? And you need to be careful because your friends will steer you wrong. All right? And here we have it right here. Because they steered Jeroboam very wrong. And friends are not usually, at a young age, they're not usually full of the knowledge and wisdom of God. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some, but you've got to be careful. And you've even got to be careful at any age. Okay? Because you need to go for wise counsel. And you need to go by how you feel in the spirit. If your spirit doesn't bear witness with that person, then adios. Okay? Because I cannot afford to take bad advice. I can only afford, even at my age, I can only afford to get advice from godly people. And so I can think of many, many older people that influenced my life for the better. And as for young people go, I can only think of one that really influenced my life, and that was my friend in the 8th grade when I was 13 years old who invited me to her church to a revival. I can say truthfully, and I've thought about this, was there anybody else, young person, that affected my life? And no, that was just that one girl. And so another friend, that impacted my life, maybe not for the most, but it was God's will, was going in the Navy. I had a friend who went into the Sea Cadets as a teenager, where you go for the summer, and prior to graduating from high school, and that's how I got the idea of going into the Navy. So probably those two people, girls, were the most impactful on my life. So here's the thing. See, we want to ask God to bring someone that can speak into our lives and steer us the right way. We want to talk to older people who've been there, done that. All right, and they may know something about what you're interested in, or they may have connections that a young person would never have. And the Lord knew Rehoboam was going to listen to his friends, so he brought forth the result, and the result was sin. And see, we need to pay attention here, especially young people, because there's so many scriptures that bear this fact out. And you can argue with me till the sun goes down, but you'll lose, because the Bible stresses the issue over and over again, to listen to the older people who've been there, done that, and most of all, those who are following God and are filled with the Holy Spirit. So picking up in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, we're going to look at verse 12. 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. And Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon, and Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met together by the pool of Gibeon, and they sat down, and one on the one side of the pool, and the other on the other side of the pool. All right, so we got Republicans and Democrats here. Okay, and you got one on one side of the pool and you got one on the other side of the pool. So you got the leaders of Ishbosheth and the leaders of David. And they're sitting down on these opposing sides, and they're going to talk this matter out. So there was a war that took place that was led by Abner, who was instrumental in putting Ishbosheth in as king after his father Saul's death. And Joab, of course, he was the leader of the army with David. And so basically we're having this civil war. between Abner and Joab. And it's recorded in quite a few places in the Bible. But looking at 14, verse 14, it says, "And Abner said to Joab, 'Let the young men now arise and play before us.' And Joab said, 'Let them arise.' Then there arose and went over by number 12 of Benjamin, which pertained to Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. And they caught every one his fellow by the head, and thrust his sword in his fellow's side. So they fell down together, wherefore that place was called Helkath-Hazurim. Helkath-Hazurim, which is in Gibeon. And there was a very sore battle that day, and Abner was beaten, and the men of Israel before the servants of David." Now, I'm kind of glad, right, aren't you, that we don't settle disputes this way anymore, okay? But this is the way they did it. And it seems that the tribe of Benjamin is always on the wrong side. And, of course, Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. And I talked about the tribe of Benjamin and their evil doings in Preppers last time, knowing God's will. And it seems that they are always going against their brethren in some evil way. And you know, it says, "Come, let us play." Well, they weren't playing what we think of play, okay? They were warring. They were like gladiators. And what they did was they picked the 12 best, strongest warriors on each side to fight it out. And at first I thought maybe they were doing this in a way to determine the outcome between them. Best of the best,
Yeah.
Let the best of the best go at it, see who wins, who would be king over Israel. But that's not so, because when we read further on down, it didn't stop with this skirmish, if you will, between both sides of 12. And remembering that Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, thus 12 of the men of the Benjamites fought the 12 men of David's. And it was a fierce, grueling scene, with David's men prevailing over Ishbosheth's. So verse 16 says that they named the place Helkath-Hazurim, and that means plot of the sharp blades, or the field of heroes. All right, and then we keep going in verse 18. "And there were 3 sons of Zeruiah there, Joab and Abishai, and Asahel. And Asahel was as light of foot as a wild roe. And Asahel pursued after Abner, and in going he turned not to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, 'Art thou Asahel?' And he answered, 'I am.' And Abner said to him, 'Turn thee aside to thy right hand or to thy left, and lay thee hold on one of the young men, and take thee his armor.' But Asahel would not turn aside from following him." All right, so what's going on here? Well, what's going on is Abner was, as you know, the captain of the guard for Saul's son Ishbosheth. And so Joab, the son of Zeruiah, is the captain of the guard of David. And Joab has 2 brothers, Abishai or Abishai, and Asahel. So Asahel says he could run very fast like a deer, and he took off after Abner, following him. So Abner is obviously very annoyed, right? Because he knows he's being followed. So he addresses him, and he thinks he knows who he is. He recognizes him, and not really wanting to provoke Joab by killing his brother, Abner warns Asahel to turn from following him, but he won't. And so it seems like a senseless death, and I'm not sure what Asahel was trying to accomplish by provoking Abner, but we're going to see it doesn't end well. So verse 22, "And Abner said again to Asahel, 'Turn thee aside from following me. Wherefore should I smite thee to the ground? How then should I hold up my face to Joab thy brother?' Howbeit he refused to turn aside. Wherefore Abner, with the hinder end of the spear, smote him under the 5th rib, that the spear came out behind him, and he fell down there and died in the same place. And it came to pass that as many as came to the place where Asahel fell down and died stood still." So this was a senseless death, in my opinion. a senseless death that of course could have further provoked Abner. And this story is really going to have a lot of twists and turns in it as we keep going. And so in verse 24, Joab also and Abishai pursued after Abner. And the sun went down when they were come to the hill of Ammah that lieth before Giah by the way of the wilderness of Gibeon. And the children of Benjamin gathered themselves together after Abner, and became one troop, and stood on the top of the hill. So here we go again. Benjamin is up to no good. Okay, because they're going against the will of God. So verse 26. Then Abner called to Joab and said, Shall the sword devour forever? Knowest thou not that it will be bitterness in the latter end? How shall it be then, ere thou bid the people return from following their brethren? And Joab said, As God liveth, unless thou hast spoken, surely thee in the morning the people had gone up every one from following his brother. So Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood still, and pursued after Israel no more. Neither fought they any more. And Abner and his men walked all that night through the plain, and passed over Jordan, and went through all of Bethron, and they came to Mahanaim. All right. Now this is a little hard to understand what's going on, but if we go back to that fight between the two sides in verse 14, see, it was Abner that suggested that the best of the two sides go at it. All right. So here Joab and his men are pursuing Abner. And could the pursuit have to do with Joab's brother just being killed? I don't know. It doesn't say for sure, but I think that's I think that's plausible. So the Benjamites gathered themselves together behind Abner to defend him, and then Abner called to Joab, showing how close the two opposing parties are. And Abner says to Joab, Are we going to fight forever? And this is not going to turn out well. That's what he's saying. Shouldn't you call off your men, Joab? And so Joab listened, and then he blew a trumpet, and Joab's men stopped pursuing the men of Abner. And I know this is a little bit confusing, but why do you think Abner, okay, which is Saul's man, now Ishbosheth's man, why do you think he backed down at this point?
Because they'd already been beaten.
Because they were in a civil war, and these are one tribe. Okay, they're fighting one tribe fighting another tribe. But they're all Israelites, but they're different tribes. Okay, just like we're all Americans, but some of us are Yankees and some of us are Southerners. Okay. All right, so I mean, really, this is reminiscent of the Civil War in America, is it not? And so we're all Americans, but our ancestors took sides. Mine fought in the Civil War. Mine fought at Kennesaw. Okay, on my mother's side, and they fought for the South. So we're all Americans, but we did take sides. And I think Joab, which is David's man, I think he realized that the goal was to unite the 12 tribes under David and not to continue to divide them. And so I think he had wisdom from the Lord, and he was thinking this out for the future, and not simply in the anger of the moment. Because we all know being united as one is far greater than fighting the world on your own. And don't we see that going on right now? And I'm very thankful for what we're seeing already.
Amen.
And I hope it continues. So, because, but at the same time, somebody's got to stand up and fight for what's right. And if we're silent all the time, you know, and I was thinking about this, I was hesitant to show anything Trump because I saw graffiti and I saw people's things, possessions vandalized and stuff for having Trump signs and things like that. So it's amazing how we've never seen a political election where it was so hush-hush. There was really not a whole lot of signs out like there normally are and everything, and yet the whole nation came together. And so it was sort of a silent protest. But you've got to fight. And if something's going on, we've got to stand against it, regardless of what they may do to us, because then we'll all be losers. So verse 30, and Joab returned from following Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there lacked of David's servants 19 men and Asahel. But the servants of David had smitten of Benjamin and of Abner's men, so that 360 men died. And they took up Asahel and buried him in the sepulchre of his father, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and they came to Hebron at break of day. All right, so here we now know that Joab knew for sure that Abner, Saul's man, had killed his brother Asahel. We really weren't sure up until this point. And they buried him with his father in Bethlehem. And then Joab, David's man, and all his men walked all night, and they traveled all night and came to Hebron, and they got there at daybreak. And as is much of the Bible, there are hidden symbols and meanings. And you could say that the sun was rising over Israel that morning as one tribe, as 12 tribes united. And truly, this was the beginning of the end of the divided Israel during David's life. And Ishbosheth ruled 2 years, and of course this was not God's will for him to rule those 2 years, but he ruled 2 years, and I think the lesson, that we can learn from this is about waiting on God. And as fallen human beings, we want everything to happen immediately. And boy, if it doesn't happen immediately, boy, we'll march to the beat of our own drum in a heartbeat. And but God works in and through man. He could have kicked Ishbosheth out on day one, but he didn't. And I've seen that in my life. God works through other human beings. And so what I want right now cannot come to pass right this minute, because he's still working on somebody else that is going to impact my life. And so he works through the human beings, and he works slowly. Okay, and I think if anybody's got any age on them, they can tell you that God never does anything fast. So if you got it in your head that it's going to happen fast, you might as well get used to it. God is not in a hurry. And I believe one reason he's not in a hurry, because God is outside of time. All right, and God made time for man after the fall. And so he works in these situations in and through people. But somehow, some way, his will always ultimately comes to pass, miraculously. And I can't even tell you how that works, but it always does. And but he's got to work through the circumstances at hand. And sometimes it takes time. And in this case, it took 2 years to reunite Israel under David as king. And sometimes it takes time for us to surrender our will. Sometimes we got to go through things before we'll get to a point where we're willing to surrender our will to his. And so I want to ask you, what do you do while you wait? Boy, I tell you, the waiting is tough. Because I've had to wait. Because I've had a word. And I've had to wait and wait and wait and wait. But you know what? It always comes to pass if you wait. And that's the one thing you have to do while you're waiting, is not to lose faith. Because David knew God called him to be the king. He knew he was supposed to be the king over the whole 12 tribes. And can't you see him wringing his hands and, I know this isn't God's will. I know Ishbosheth's not supposed to. I know we're supposed to be one, but oh God, you told me this. You told me I'm going to be king, but what am I supposed to do? Put yourself in his position. And so that time of waiting, we cannot lose faith. And we have to understand, especially if you got a word, that you just have to keep waiting. And you have to know that somehow, some way, it's going to come out. for your good, and it's going to come out according to His will. And we've got to hang on for dear life to God's word and to anything that He told you. And see, what we want to do is we want to cast that word aside. Well, maybe I imagined it. Maybe that was just me. Maybe God really didn't tell me that. And believe me, I'm telling you this from experience. Okay? And then you look at the circumstances. Well, you know, I just don't see how it's going to pan out. I can't see how this is going to work out. And you know, it won't work out because so and so won't play ball. See, and I've seen this play out in my life more than once, and I've questioned what I've heard because it took so long for something to come to fruition. And honestly, there were times that I wrestled with my faith and I questioned whether God really said that. Did He really mean what I thought He said? Did He really know the people that were involved that weren't going along with His plan? Or maybe that I myself was hindering the plan. And maybe I haven't surrendered in an area, you know, and that's why the plan can't come to fruition, whatever. But what I'm saying is David had to wait. And we have to wait. And I've seen people give up on the promise just like Abraham did. Abraham's our greatest example. And he gave up on a sure word that he knew that he got from God. And he gave up on it, and he took Sarah's handmaid to help God out. And then shortly after, moving away from that promise, then they saw the fulfillment of the promise. But then it was too late. It was too late in one sense, because yes, he got the promised seed, but then he got a whole big barrel of trouble that we're still dealing with today.
It just strikes me that the Abraham and Sarah thing is a second Adam and Eve. Eat of this fruit.
Yes, exactly. And just like we're paying for Adam and Eve's sin, we're paying for Sarah and Abraham's sin. So what I'm saying, if you got a word from the Lord through the Holy Spirit, and I don't care if it takes 20 years like it did for Abraham, then you've got to hang on to that word for dear life. Because if you move ahead, if you give up, you're going to ruin everything. You're going to ruin God's plan. You're going to ruin His will. And again, God is not in a hurry like we generally are. And you cannot put God on a timeline. I've done that. Well, logically, it doesn't make sense that it's taken this long. No, it doesn't to me, but He knows. I don't know. And I'm trying to make Him fit my timeline. And that's what Abraham and Sarah were doing. And so this is a major mistake that we make. And notice God didn't seem to be in a hurry when delivering David from Saul. Have you noticed that? And didn't that go on? I think it went on for like 15 years. You know, I think during that time I'd be pretty upset with God. Lord, what? You know, you called me. You said I'm going to be king, and this guy's trying to kill me, and what the heck, you know? And but God didn't seem to be in too big of a hurry. So I think there's a lot going on here in these stories in the supernatural realm that maybe we don't see on the surface. And you got to really think about it when you read these stories. And I think David was learning, and this is why God let it go on for 15 years, because he was learning every day about surrender. He was learning every day about truly trusting in the Lord and truly being dependent on God. And to be an effective king, he needed to go through these trials and tribulations. He needed to go through something. You know, we see evidence of child kings and things like that, but a child cannot be an effective king. They don't know anything. Okay, David was a kid, really, when he killed Goliath. He really didn't know anything. Okay, so he had to go through these trials and tribulations. He had to go through life to be able to learn. And I believe that's why God postponed all this and had him go through all this. Because guess what? He would have relied on his own logic, his own knowledge, his own feelings, and he couldn't be an effective king for the Lord if he did that. He had to learn how to be led by the Lord and how to be a godly leader. Because he would have surely gone his own way, just like we all do. Just like Saul did. And just like most of the kings of Israel did. But see, and then God's will can't be accomplished. It can only be accomplished when we surrender our will to His. So now let's say you move ahead and you've heard God's voice and you know His plan, but in your impatience, you go against Him. And you give up just like Abraham did. You're going to reap the consequences. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't be redeemed. It doesn't mean that God can't fix it. It doesn't mean that, you're doomed to hell or anything like that. But what I'm telling you is that you're not in God's perfect will because you messed it up. Abraham and Sarah messed it up. They still got the promise, but they had a whole nother set of issues that they had to deal with for the rest of their lives and that we are having to deal with today. So I'm not trying to scare you, but I'm trying to help us through these stories to understand that you absolutely cannot go by the way things look. And another thing, you don't know what's in somebody else's heart. You know what some people think just blows my mind. How can they think that? It's like how can so many people look so different? Well, we all come from one man and one woman, and yet we look so different, and we think different. It's amazing what people think. And so we have no way of knowing what's in somebody's heart. And so you can't see how God is working and maneuvering in circumstances and how He's changing people's hearts that you could never change. And people that you would never dream would even change in a million years. And so you have no way of knowing what's going on behind the proverbial veil. And so we've got to hang on to the words that God gave us by faith. And then we've got to wait. No matter how long it takes, you've got to wait. And the waiting's going to be hard. And David should be an encouragement to us. He waited. He waited a long time, but the payoff made it worthwhile. And it will make it worthwhile for you. Because listen, who wants to deal with an Ishmael? I don't. I'd rather wait. As painful as it is, I'd rather wait than to deal with an Ishmael. So when Abraham didn't wait on God's promise, he got himself in a big jam and he really messed the world up. And we're dealing with Abraham's impatience even today. And is that not amazing? I mean, to me, it's absolutely mind-boggling. But all that turmoil in the Middle East that's going on even today, all this Gaza stuff, all that is due to Abraham's sin. And not waiting on God's promise to be fulfilled. I mean, can you imagine a Middle East with no Ishmaels? With no Arabs? That wasn't God's plan. And so what I want us to see is that what we do affects other people whether we realize it or not. And again, listen, I've clearly heard the Lord speak to me as clearly if He called me on the phone or He sat next to me and spoke to me. And but as time went on, the circumstances didn't match what He said. I gave up. And I hate to say that. But I've given up, and because I didn't understand. And what does the Word say? It says, my people perish for a lack of knowledge. And I don't ever want to do that again. And if you don't understand, like that rope bridge Dr. Mary Neely spoke about, I read you about that rope bridge last week where she said, you can have the hope that the rope bridge is going to hold you should you go step out on it. You can have faith that you believe that it's going to hold you if you should step out on it. But when you do step out on it, you have to trust. And I thought that was such a great example. And so when you put your weight on it, you have to trust that that rope bridge is going to hold you up. And you believe it so firmly that you're willing to go out over this rope bridge and to cross it and to have trust, which is more than hope. You see, I can hope that it'll hold me, but that doesn't give me enough confidence to actually go step out on it. And so we've got to trust that God said to cross it, and then He'll ensure that it will hold us up. All right, so back to 2 Samuel 2:30. It says, Abner lost 330 men, and David lost 19 and 1, and the one being the brother of Joab.
360. You said 3 score.
Oh, okay.
Score's 20.
Okay. So it says, chapter 3, 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. Now there was long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, but David waxed stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul waxed weaker and weaker. See, we can't ignore this. This is so important because I want to really explore this, because why do you think Saul's house, meaning his supporters, because I don't believe there was anybody left in his house, much meaning his family, but because they were all killed, but the supporters waxed weaker and weaker. So Saul's supporters and the supporter of his house waxed weaker and weaker. Why do you think his house got weaker and weaker and David's house got stronger and stronger? Because it was God, because it was God's will that David be the king, and of course we know it was God's will initially for Saul, but he blew it. And so the only male descendant of Saul to survive at this point is Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth was Jonathan's lame son, who was 5 years old at the time of his father's and grandfather's death, Jonathan and Saul. And in time, he came under the protection of David, as you probably know the story. So Mephibosheth ended up having a young son named Micah, who had 4 sons and descendants named until the 9th generation. So remember, David set out to make sure that somebody in Saul's line lived. And that happened through Mephibosheth. So again, we see David's, I think, unhuman response to Saul's family. If somebody tried to kill you for 15 years, do you really want his family to live? Do you really want him to live? And I'm sure his chief motivation, of course, was his love for Jonathan. Okay, Saul's son, in saving Mephibosheth. But you know as well as I do that vengeance can, and most of the time, will spill out over onto the people that weren't involved, right? And I think if David had not been a man after God's own heart, if supernatural works were not done in David, there is no way he would have even wanted Mephibosheth to live. Because you don't know, Mephibosheth might have come after him. Or Mephibosheth descendants could come after him. That's why, you kill the children, is because they'll grow up to come kill you. So I think it's worth reiterating that again, we see David caring more about God and what God thinks than his own hurt feelings. And this takes surrender. And you can't do it by yourself. This is a not human response. So we cannot survive this life unless we have a purpose, and David had a purpose. And what was his purpose?
To serve God.
It's to serve God. His purpose was so much bigger than himself. His purpose was to follow and know God, and he knew God led him from being a simple shepherd boy that no one had respect for. Remember when Samuel showed up at their house to anoint him king, his dad didn't even call him in from the fields.
He's just a kid out there.
Yeah, he's just a kid. his brothers, nobody respected him. He was just a kid. And yet he was going to be the second and the greatest king of Israel. And that only happens when you surrender to a holy God. And remember when we read about Goliath coming out against the children of Israel and how David was incensed. Remember how angry he was? And he was incensed for his people. And he was appalled that this creature would defy the living God.
And nobody cared. Nobody would go against him.
Nobody would go against him. And he was incensed that this thing, he knew what it was. He knew Goliath was a Nephilim and or Rephaim actually. And he knew that, and he was incensed, and he knew that this thing was defying the true and living God. That his purpose began to rise up out of it that God put in him. And he fought in the name of the Lord. He fought for the Lord's sake, not his own. He didn't fight that Goliath to be a hero of his own and to become well known in Israel. He didn't do that. He fought for the true and living God. And so God saw that, and he honored him with victory. And I'm sure, except for some brief distractions, David lived his life like this. And yes, we see the distractions. We see when he got off course. But guess what? He always came back. And I love, in Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, like Abraham's there. Well, Abraham got off track. But guess what? Abraham came back. And God doesn't hold it against anybody as long as they come back. And so David lived his life outside of himself. He lived for the purpose to which he knew that he was called and that he knew was the Lord's will for him. So with this in mind, can you imagine the difference in our children if they were taught that their lives were not their own? Listen, if I had it to do over again, oh my gosh, I would do everything so much different than I did it. But you know what? It's imperative that you teach your children from the beginning not to be self-serving. Because they are born self-serving. And they will die self-serving if you do not teach them not to be that way. And they've got to be taught that they're here for one reason, and that is to be of service to God in whatever he calls them to do. And I think today we're in an uphill battle with our young people that we've never been in before with technology. And now the kids are, they're so excited about Musk and his Neuralink and being integrated with, and now I can't tell you that I wouldn't be either as a young person. If you told me that you could implant something in my brain so that I can make straight A's, I would have done that in a heartbeat. Okay? Because me and my mother would have gotten along a whole lot better if I could make straight A's, okay? And so yeah, I would have done that. So I can understand where they're coming from. But they got challenges that, thank you God, that I was born when I was. That I don't have to go through all that they're having to go through. But we've got to teach them that they are here to serve God, and they are here to find his will and to and I even hate saying that, finding his will. But he has a call on everybody's life for whatever, and you have to walk in that call and walk in that purpose, because if you don't, you're going to self-destruct because you have nothing to live for. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up in verse 2 next week. So I know this was a little wordy and a little hard maybe to follow, but I hope you kind of got the gist of what's going on. And does anybody have anything to say, Chris, before we go?
You were waxing out potential reasons why Abner was going to do what he was going to do, to continue putting Saul and his legacy in positions of power. I think one of the things, the signs he saw was David still honoring Saul. I mean, that's kind of,
Strange.
yeah, I mean.
I mean, it really
David
is.
was meant to be king, maybe, but he's still honoring Saul,
Yeah.
and, you know, so, Abner's gotta be confused by that a little bit.
You know, so
Because
I'm
David's
thinking of Trump.
Yes.
In a way, he was honoring Biden on Inauguration Day. He was polite, and wasn't he? And he was,
Yeah.
Diana's kind of looking off.
Well, he
You
did
think-
have a few things to say in
Yeah.
his speech about how the country was and
Yeah.
why it was,
Yeah.
whose fault it was.
Well, I thought,
He didn't name him specifically in the speech.
yeah. And Biden honored Trump by going along with all the tradition of inauguration, you know what I'm saying? But you know good and well they can't stand each other.
Speaking of Biden, did you hear that he was, well, I don't know what the right word is, anointed, accepted, ordained as a 36th minister of a black basic group or something?
No.
Yeah, I saw a photo.
No, I didn't see that. The man's evil.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just downright evil. And but so was Saul. But again,
Thank goodness he can't complete a thought.
but
Yeah,
again,
he's not gonna work behind the scenes like Obama did to bring about things that aren't good.
Yeah.
Good point.
I still think they were both honorable, if you want to say that, on Inauguration Day, and kept with the
Yeah, they were
traditions
civil.
and civil, yeah, civil and honorable, and let's just keep in mind to always honor the office, whatever the office is.
They honor-
Whatever the office, just honor the office and then fight however you can to change the person in the office if you have to, but not in an evil, destructive way. All right, well, bless y'all. I know that was a little tedious, but,
The moral of that story is honor the office of the treasurer here at First.